The Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right. We're back with the Truth Attack. So, we are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the network operating and the shows coming. So, if you enjoy the shows, the information, the discussions, the topics, and the guests and hosts on the other shows on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website, get signed up as a monthly subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $20 a month. Every membership counts, and again, we do need your support to keep the network operating. And if you want to get fully informed on the fraudulent and unconstitutional fraud that's been perpetrated on the American people since World War II in the name of income tax, you need to find your way over to tax-freedom.com and start reading. And if you wanted to pick up a copy of the information, you could do that over at irszoom.com for just $6. I've got my little 100-page pamphlet, The Simple Truth About Income Tax, which explains what really happened back in 1913 and pretty much brings you up to date on what's happening today. I think maybe the Moore decision isn't covered in that version 2, but I'm going to have it in version 3 here, available shortly on Amazon. So, find your way over to taxfreedom.com and read the articles about the broken tax system and the SCOTUS ruling in June. And we're going to come back to that, but first let's go through a little bit of current events. Finally, we've got a president who is knocking it out of the park on every front. I mean, he's just pounding it out every day. He's out there doing more, talking to the reporters, taking questions, creating policy, negotiating deals. Finally, we've got a president that is a live human being and acting on policy concerns and that are beneficial to the American people rather than detrimental to them. And he has designated the cartels smuggling the drugs in, mostly South American cartels, as terrorist organizations, and going to focus the FBI under Kash Patel, who got confirmed today, on going after the cartels and their smuggling and territorial sales operations in how many cities in the country? Count them. So that's certainly good. They're targeting the criminal element of the illegal aliens. It's like I've been saying all along, don't tell me illegal aliens don't commit more crimes than the citizens. The only reason why I have that statistic is because the 1 million drug deals that are criminal on the streets every day aren't reported as crime, so they're not in the statistics. And they're all being perpetrated by illegal aliens, the cartel drug members. So don't tell me they don't commit the crime. They are the crime in the inner cities areas, and it's about time the federal government went after them because it's interstate commerce and it's international border crossing. So that's FBI federal right up the wall. They should be in every city in the country where the gangs are, nailing their asses down instead of going after Catholic parents and people who believe that abortion is wrong and are peacefully protesting outside the abortion clinics trying to get information to girls going in. I mean, you've got the wrong focus, right? Let's focus on crime rather than the dissemination of information. And of course, that's what the liberals have been trying to do for the last 4 years, right? Shut down the dissemination of honest information because they can only win if you don't know the truth and you're forced to believe in and live and act by their false claims of what is real. Like all the nonsense we've seen in the last 4 years and all the nonsense we've seen since World War II relating to the income tax, which I'm going to talk more about here in just a bit. Okay, they are aggressively going after ending the war in Ukraine because it's in the best interest of everyone. You've got a situation in the Ukraine right now where it's not winnable for either side. It's an endless artillery battle that goes on forever until someone uses a nuclear bomb. That's just, not going to help anyone. It's bad for America. It's drawn down our stockpiles. It's cost us hundreds of billions of dollars. It's stressing relationships with everybody in Europe. It's time to end that war. And people who say, oh, you're giving in to Putin, well, hey, it never would have started if Trump had been in office, because he would have helped Ukraine stop them at the border as the Russian troops massed before the invasion. And when it was suggested to Joe Biden that he helped the Ukrainians arm their border in response to the Russians massing on the other side of it, Joe Biden said he wasn't going to do that because he didn't want to provoke Putin. Oh my God, he didn't want to provoke Putin. What a coward! When the enemy masses on your border, if you don't put troops there to oppose them, you have effectively invited them in. And that's just what happened, because Biden is a coward, and he didn't want to provoke Putin. So he wouldn't confront him. That's a coward. That's not shrewd thinking. And Doge is clawing back hundreds of billions of dollars, possibly into the trillion, and now they're talking about possibly paying a Doge dividend to the American people. And I'll be quite honest, I don't think that's a good idea. We just paid out how many trillions of dollars to the American people for COVID-19, and what did it do? It motivated half the country to not go to work. Oh yeah, just give us free money. Okay, fine, we don't have to work. Great. And who are you going to give it to? Taxpayers? The poor? The wealthy? Only people who filed returns? They're not the ones who need it. So no, I don't think you give the dividend to the American people. You should keep it in the Treasury and use it to fund the budget without borrowing from the Federal Reserve Bank for as long as it lasts. Maybe only a year or two, but that will reduce the rate of increase of the deficit, which is the first thing you have to do to stop this spending, along with, as I've said before, balance the budget and bring it back in line with revenues so that you're not borrowing $2 trillion a year, because this can't go on, adding $8 trillion in deficit spending with every 4-year administration that occurs. You're already at 36, headed for 44. I mean, where's the limit? At some point, you're going to reach it unless you can get a stabilization of the currency, and at this point, that needs to be global, which is why Donald Trump should immediately pursue with Saudi Arabia restoring the petrodollar and kill off this BRICS nonsense about how they're going to put up a competing basket of worthless currencies to compete with the dollar, and Saudi Arabia should take it instead of the dollar. No. I know Biden screwed it all up, but Trump can fix that relationship in a day. And he should tell Saudi Arabia, we will defend you with everything we got. Just put the world back on the petrodollar. And that will force every government on the planet to start warehousing dollars without worrying about anything else. And that will remove the excess currency from circulation and help to get a control on inflation. It will also bring down the price of petrol as the world goes back to realizing that's the most economically and viable source of energy for a restoration of a global economy that is faltering under the artificially high price of energy imposed by the liberal policies of Biden and other governments globally. This is being done to the people by the governments, not by any real shortage, but by government imposing excessive costs and taxes on the cost of producing energy from any source other than wind or solar. Good luck with that. Good luck with that when it gets dark and cold. Going back to the caves, you will be. So don't give the dividend to the people. Keep it in the Treasury. Help disaster victims in California, North Carolina, Louisiana, anywhere else where we had the hurricanes and the floods that have devastated the areas. Use it to help those people. You only had $700 for North Carolina. Well, you just clawed back, what, $300 billion from nonsense? Spend a little bit on disaster victims who got nothing or being cheated. I mean, even if it comes down to buying the small homes that Elon Musk manufactures, he's the only one doing it. Just like he was the only one capable of delivering rural internet service for less than $1,200 a home, while the other providers are charging as much as $100,000 and yet failing to hook up any amount of meaningful folks. And they took the contract away from Elon Musk the minute Joe Biden said, oh, he's worth investigating. So they shut down the contract with the only provider that was capable of doing it economically and feasibly, and was actually doing it, because he already had the infrastructure in place. The satellites were there. All you need is a piece of equipment on the ground to pick up the signal. Bang, you got internet. Put a bigger piece and bang, you got internet in the whole neighborhood, which would have worked in a lot of rural communities, but no. They didn't want to have the government spend money efficiently on a system that worked. That would prove it's possible for private industry to perform, because of course it would have been Musk, not the government. So they screwed that up, and they should keep that money and use it for disaster victims and to reduce the deficit borrowing over the next 2 years. And the last thing we got happening is the IRS is firing over 7,000 workers. Well, I don't know. Biden hired 80,000. So firing 7,000 is, of course, good, but that still leaves 73,000 more to harass and eat out the substance of the American people, which is, if you recall, was one of the causes for the American Revolution. Has sent forth swarms of bureaucrats to eat out and harass and eat out our substance. And that's exactly what the IRS does today. And we're going to get into this. I don't believe the IRS or the income tax can survive the coming revelation that has been released already by the Supreme Court in the Moore decision. And the rest of the mainstream media and the politicians and the attorneys and the judges don't want to admit it. But what the Supreme Court did in Moore is inescapable. It's going to apply to all tax cases, and it destroys the current de facto operations of the Internal Revenue Service, which have been based since the mid-1950s on the false and erroneous belief that the 16th Amendment created a new power to tax directly the earnings of the American people without any limitation being applicable to the new power allegedly created under the amendment. And of course, this is nonsensical. It's absolutely absurd. The word direct isn't in the amendment, so you can't add it and create a power that directly conflicts with the Article 1 provisions limiting direct taxation. 123 says representatives in direct taxes shall be apportioned amongst the several states, and 194 says no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census. So both of those clauses still exist. They weren't repealed. They weren't amended. You can't add direct to the 16th Amendment by interpretive opinion without engineering an inherent and irreconcilable conflict with the two pre-existing unrepealed and unamended provisions. And then, if you insist that there's a new power created to tax directly and without apportionment or any other limitation, where's the enabling enforcement clause to authorize the Congress to write law to enforce this allegedly new power, allegedly created by the amendment? There is no authority to write law. There's no enabling enforcement clause in the amendment, and that's one of the reasons why the Supreme Court ruled in 1916 that no new powers are created. How could a new power be created when there's no authority to write any new law to enforce a new power? So it's not a power to tax directly, and it can't be a new power to tax indirectly as a fourth category beyond impost duty and excise, because no new powers are created. And taxing income directly, taxing the earnings, the fruits of labor, that's direct taxation. So we're going to look at that in the next segment. We're coming up on the first commercial break. I think I hear the music coming on. So this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Stay tuned. We're going to be back in 5 with more on the false
Call 211 or visit stayfitforduty.org.
I forgot to click off. Okay, this is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and we're just going to get right back into it. As we came up on the commercial break there, I was pointing out that since the mid-1950s, the federal government has been applying the federal income tax as a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. That was obviously an erroneous interpretation, but that's what they've done. Now, the Supreme Court says in Moore and in Brushaber and right from the beginning that income taxes are indirect taxes. That means they're part of impost, duty, and excise taxation. Foreign persons, foreign places, foreign imports, exports, commodities, licenses, and corporations. Those are the only activities and transactions subject to indirect federal taxation by impost, duty, and excise. Impost taxing foreign activity, duty taxing exports, excise taxing commodities, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, licenses to sell those things, and the corporate privilege, where it is the privilege that is the subject of the tax, not the mere having money, earning money, or having profit. The profit has to be derived from the federally taxable activities subject to the impost, duty, and excise. If it isn't derived from a taxable activity, it's not taxable simply as profit. Profit isn't a viable basis for indirect taxation. It's only a viable basis if the tax is direct, which is what they've been doing for 55 years because they essentially admitted labor and income isn't by itself subject to indirect taxation. It has to be derived from the impost duty or excise taxable activities. So they couldn't do that, so they lied and said it's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. And the liberal Supreme Court let them get away with it the same way they let them get away with Roe v. Wade, Chevron regulatory deference, and affirmative action. These are all liberal nonsense passed by the court in that area that this court has taken out. And now they've taken out the federal income tax. Nobody understands it, but that's what they've done. They've told the IRS, not yet, but they will in the next case, you can't assess it as a direct tax without basis in impost duty or excise. There's no new power created. So how did we get to this ridiculous situation where the government says the tax, or rather it says your earnings, the labor of a person, is subject to federal taxation? I mean, that's simply inconceivable to the founding fathers that every time a citizen worked, he would owe tax to the federal government. It's inconceivable. So how did we get to the point where every time you work, it's considered taxable? Even now, the judges are trying to say, oh, it's indirect, so we can tax it because it taxes income under the 16th Amendment. No, that's a new power, and taxing income on that basis is a direct tax. Let's take a look at what the courts have said historically about this. Some of this is a little dry, but I'll read it quickly and explain so that we don't spend too much time. This is from Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust in 1895, which was not overturned by the 16th Amendment or by Bruce-Shaber. In Bruce-Shaber, the court addresses the legitimacy of an indirect tax on income that only needs to be uniform. In Pollock, they address the fact that direct taxes must be apportioned. One case addresses direct taxation, the other addresses indirect taxation. They address two entirely different subject matters, and one cannot overrule the other. In fact, what the 16th Amendment does, absent an enabling enforcement clause, the only thing it does, the only people it affects are the judges of the courts, the Supreme Court specifically, which can never rule again what they ruled in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust. And that is that a tax on rent was derived from property, and taxes on property are direct taxes, and as a direct tax, it couldn't be sustained because it wasn't apportioned to the states for payment. So the tax on rent was unconstitutional. They can never do that again. Now, I think the decision was wrong because the corporation earning rent isn't a tax on property, it's a tax on the corporate privilege of earning money as a corporation. That's excise taxation. It doesn't matter what source it comes from when it's earned by a corporation. It also probably could have been justified as an excise on the consumption of the commodity, the land. And it certainly wasn't true that the revenue streamed from the property. Nonsense. It didn't stream from the property. It streamed from a third-party tenant's leasing of the commodity, the property. And that third-party tenant's leasing and use of the commodity is subject to excise taxation. And they never got a check from the property. They got it from the tenant. That's excise taxation. So it was never a direct tax. The bad decision gave us the 16th Amendment, which has worked to enslave the American people since World War II, since it wasn't enforced or applied to the American people before then. So let's read a little bit about what they wrote in Pollock, because this has actually got a lot of good information about the historical nature of the tax and how things were perceived previous to the 16th Amendment, which nobody wants to talk about anymore, because the 16th Amendment redid everything. Now it's a direct tax that everybody has to pay, all citizens in all states, on everything you earn, you slaves. Yeah, right. No, I don't think so. Let's read page 568 from Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust in 1895. In the debates in the House of Representatives preceding the passage of the Act of Congress to lay duties upon carriages for the conveyance of persons, approved June 5th, 1794, Mr. Sedgwick said that a capitation tax and taxes on land and on property and income generally were direct charges, as well and in the immediate as ultimate sources of contribution. There you go. In 1896, they considered taxes on income direct taxes because they couldn't be avoided and they were on the revenues of the person directly laid. He had considered those and those only as direct taxes in their operation and effects. On the other hand, a tax imposed on a specific article of personal property, and particularly if objects of luxury, as in the case under consideration, carriages, he had never supposed had been considered a direct tax within the meaning of the Constitution. Mr. Dexter observed that his colleague had stated the meaning of direct taxes to be a capitation tax or a general tax on all taxable property of the citizens, and that a gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Nicholas, thought the meaning was that all taxes are direct, which are paid by the citizen without being recompensed by the consumer. In other words, a sales tax where the store owner, the seller, only pays tax that he has collected from others. There's a shifting of the burden that creates a recompense because the tax doesn't actually come out of the pocket of the person who's paying it because he's only turned over what he's collected from the pockets of other persons as tax on the taxable transaction conducted between the two parties. Okay, so without being recompensed by the consumer, but that where the tax was only advanced and repaid by the consumer, the tax was indirect. He thought that both opinions were just. But Albert Gallatin, in his sketch of the finances of the United States, published in November 1796, said, "The most generally received opinion, however, is that by direct taxes in the Constitution, those are meant which are raised on the capital or revenue of the people. By indirect, such as are raised on their expense," in other words, at the transaction, the purchase. So as they spend money to buy something, they get taxed on the expense. As that opinion is in itself rational and comfortable to the decision which has taken place on the subject of the carriage tax, and as it appears important for the sake of preventing future controversies, which may be not more fatal to the revenue than to the tranquility of the Union, that a fixed interpretation should be generally adopted. It will not be improper to corroborate it by quoting the author from whom the idea seems to have been borrowed. He then quotes Smith's Wealth of Nations and continues, "The remarkable coincidence of the clause of the Constitution with this passage in using the word capitation as a generic expression, including the different species of direct taxes and acceptation of the word peculiar, it is believed, to Dr. Smith, leaves little doubt that the framers of the one had the other in view at the time, and that they, as well as he, by direct taxes meant those paid directly from and falling immediately on the revenue, and by indirect, those which are paid indirectly out of the revenue by falling immediately upon the expense." Okay? Income taxes were direct taxes. Taxes on the revenue as a function of working that could not be avoided and where there was no ability to shift the burden. That's a direct tax. And it's unconstitutional if it's not apportioned to the states. On page 55, it continues, "The Constitution provides that representatives in direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to numbers, and this has just been reaffirmed in more. Nothing was overturned here, and that no direct tax shall be laid except according to the enumeration provided for, and also that all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States." The men who framed and adopted that instrument had just emerged from the struggle for independence. Let's see, I think we want to skip ahead here. Now embrace the Constitution, which should go together. This is the concurrent party tax person, they surrender their own power. Uniformity was not sure. Okay, now they go about talking about how uniformity is to be applied. Thus, in the matter of taxation, the Constitution recognizes the two great classes of direct and indirect taxes and lays down two rules by which their imposition must be governed, namely the rule of apportionment as to direct taxes and the rule of uniformity as to duties, imposts, and excises, which is again exactly what the court just reaffirmed in Moore. So this is all live law today. The rule of uniformity was not prescribed to the exercise of the power granted by the first paragraph of Section 8 to lay and collect taxes, because the rule of apportionment as to taxes had already been laid down in the third paragraph of the second section. He's referring to 1, 2, 3 and the limitation of apportionment on direct taxes and the power to tax indirectly under 181, but uniformly. Okay, and this view was expressed by Chief Justice Chase in the license tax cases when he said, "It is true that the power of Congress to tax is a very extensive power. It is given in the Constitution with only one exception and only two qualifications. Congress cannot tax exports, and it must impose direct taxes by the rule of apportionment and indirect taxes by the rule of uniformity. Thus limited and thus only, it reaches every subject and may be exercised at discretion." Okay, so now let's get into where they talk about where the power of what uniformity is about. Congress has the power to attach a duty, exemptions. The uniformity thus required is the uniformity throughout the United States of the duty, impost, and excise levy. That is, the tax levied cannot be one sum upon an article at one place and a different sum upon the same article at another place. And it jumps down to, it contended by the government that the Constitution only requires a uniformity geographical in its character. That position would be satisfied if the same duty were laid in all the states, however variant it might be in different places of the same state. But it could not be sustained in the latter case without defeating the equality, which is an essential element to the uniformity required so far as the same is practical. Now this raises the question, well, let's get into it. If equality is necessary, how can tax brackets apply to the citizens? Because it's very unequal. And let's look at what they say about this. Okay. In discussing generally the requirement of uniformity found in state constitutions, he said the difficulties in the way of this construction have, however, been very largely obviated by the meaning of the word uniform, which has been adopted, holding that the uniformity must refer to articles of the same class. That is, different articles may be taxed at different amounts, provided the rate is uniform on the same class everywhere, with all people and at all times. They're talking about classes of commodities and articles of commerce. They're not talking about classes of people, because that's unconstitutional, to break the American people into different classes and then treat them differently with different rates of tax, like the income tax does, or allegedly does. But as you know, it doesn't apply to citizens in the 50 states. It applies to all persons in the possessions and foreigners in America. We'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Let's just get right back into it. I was reading from the Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust case decision, where the court held that it addressed the uniformity council. So where are we here? Where did I lose this? What did I do? Let's see if we can find class. Other than part of Okay. Here we go. The income tax law under consideration is marked by discriminating features which affect the whole law. It discriminates between those who receive an income of $4,000 and those who do not. It thus vitiates, in my judgment, by this arbitrary discrimination, the whole legislation. Hamilton says in one of his papers, The Continentalist, the genius of liberty reprobates everything arbitrary or discretionary in taxation. It exacts that every man, by a definite and general rule, should know what proportion of his property the state demands, and whatever liberty we may boast of in theory, it cannot exist in fact while arbitrary assessments continue. The legislation, in the discrimination it makes, is class legislation. Whenever a distinction is made in the burdens the law imposes or in the benefits it confers on any citizens by reason of their birth or wealth or religion, it is class legislation and leads inevitably to oppression and abuses and to general unrest and disturbance in society. It was hoped and believed that the great amendments to the Constitution, that's the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which followed the late Civil War, had rendered such legislation impossible for all future time. But the objectionable legislation reappears in the act under consideration. It is the same in essential character as that of the English income statute of 1691, which taxed Protestants at a certain rate, Catholics at a class at double the rate of Protestants, and Jews at another and separate rate. Under wise and constitutional legislation, every citizen should contribute his proportion, however small the sum, to the support of the government, and it is no kindness to urge any of our citizens to escape from that obligation. If he contributes the smallest mite of his earnings to that purpose, he will have a greater regard for the government and more self-respect. Well, what he's talking about here is the income tax brackets divide the American people into classes. And while the uniformity requirement allows by geographical uniformity different products and companies to be taxed at different rates based on how much money they make from participating in the federal activity. In other words, the income brackets, the tax brackets can be applied to corporations, licensed persons, and to foreign persons who are subject to the impost, duty, and excise, for whom income taxation is imposed on the earnings derived from the activity they engage in that's subject to the impost, duty, or excise. So you can use graduated taxes with those persons, the corporate person, the licensed person, the foreign person, but you cannot use graduated taxation with the American citizen, because that violates the prohibition on discrimination. They're allowed to discriminate against the corporate person based on how much money they make, or the foreign person based on how much money they make, or the licensed person, or in the territories and possessions where they're the territorial jurisdiction and the Constitution doesn't completely apply. So they can create these brackets to apply to different groups of persons outside of the country and only to the non-citizen inside the country. You can't put wealthy people in one bracket, poor people in another, and claim to be applying the tax uniformly. That's a lie. Even if the wealthy people in New York are treated the same as the wealthy in California and every other state, because they're not treated the same as the poor, and Congress has no power to discriminate against the American people to drop them into different tax brackets, the way Congress does have the power to discriminate against the commodities and articles of commerce subject to tax, and the corporate person, licensed person, and foreign person who don't have the full set of rights of the American people. Taxation of the American people must be uniform, and any taxation of income on the basis of labor is unconstitutional. And this is the ultimate impact the Moore decision is going to have. The income tax is going to die, and so is the IRS. It cannot survive the revolution that for the last 60 years, the IRS, the DOJ, and the federal courts have been enforcing a fraudulent version of the income tax that doesn't actually exist in law or under the Constitution. Where graduated taxation of the people exists, where class legislation that empowers the government to arbitrarily treat the different groups of people in society different with different levels of harshness or generosity of the law, that's the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. That's what they've been enforcing. A direct tax on your labor redefined as profit through Section 61, which was never domestic legislation at all. It was a Canadian tax treaty taxing citizens in Canada between 1918 and 1993. It was never domestic legislation. They started using Section 61 in 1955 under Glenshaw Glass, where the court first began interpreting the 16th Amendment as allowing a direct tax on all sources as laid out in Section 61. They missed the fact that Section 61 wasn't domestic legislation at all. It came out of Section 22A, which they got, but they missed that the original legislation that Section 22A, i.e. Section 61, was originally enacted under was not the original income tax legislation of 1913, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, which was itself foreign legislation, but that wasn't where Section 22A, Section 61 originated. They originated 5 years later in 1918. 1918? Why don't we ever hear about anything happening in 1918? Because nothing domestically happened. In 1918, they signed a 75-year-long tax treaty with Canada. And Section 22A was one of the original pieces of code, statute, law that was enacted as part of that original legislation. It was never given applicability within the 50 states. It was only enacted by Congress as part of the tax treaty with Canada. And that's how it was enforced until World War II. And in World War II, everything changed. They put the victory tax in and got away with it, a 2-year war revenue measure to fund the war. And when it expired, they didn't impose any new tax. They just kept collecting it based on the people's requesting their employer to withhold it on a W-4 form. There was no tax imposed afterward. The victory tax expired. There was no tax imposed beforehand on your labor. The victory tax was the first time the government taxed labor. They did so unconstitutionally and directly, but they got away with it, telling people you had a patriotic duty to sacrifice to help defeat the Nazis in the European theater and the Imperial Japanese in the Pacific, and if you objected, what are you, a Nazi or a Jap? Well, nobody objected, because they didn't want to go to the Japanese internment camps. And they got away with it. When the tax expired, the debt was nearly paid off. Congress looked around and said, oh my God, nobody sued. The debt's nearly gone. We can't let this power die. So they reenacted the Subtitle C laws, or rather enacted the Subtitle C laws that provide for the collection of the tax at the source by withholding by the employer based on the employee's request to the employer to take the tax from his pay before it is due to be paid next year on April 15th. Now, the only way the employer can take it from you before then is if you ask and allow it. Because he can't force you to pay a tax before it's legally due, and neither can the IRS, because that violates the 13th Amendment's prohibition on involuntary servitude. It's not due when you get paid. You can't be forced to pay it then. That's why you use a W-4, employees withholding allowance certificate. That's allowance as in permission, not $2.50 for feeding the dog and taking out the trash every week when you were 10. $2.50. So, you have a system of voluntary collection of a tax that was never imposed and cannot be imposed. You have Section 61 being fraudulently and unconstitutionally being used as the basis for the enforcement of a direct tax on all earnings, not profit, but earnings, based on the source of the earnings. And of course, that's another absurd element of the tax, isn't it? Because there is no profit in an hourly wage rate. It's an equal exchange of value for value. The employer puts up dollars, the employee puts up time, effort, knowledge, intelligence, honesty, consistently, reputation, ability, wisdom, knowledge, application, experience. All of these things go into determining how much you get paid for an hour, and neither side makes profit on the hourly wage. If either side did, they wouldn't continue the relationship. They'd demand to be compensated, because the other side is making profit on every hour of work. So it has to be negotiated. It is, and for the wage that the employee makes, there is no profit. Labor doesn't constitute profit. It exchanges value. It's an exchange of value for value. Property for ability, integrity, consistency. And there's no profit in it. That's absurd. The idea that every time you worked for an hour, you would owe up to 40% of what you earned to the federal government? Are you kidding me? That's slavery. That's not even peonage. That's slavery. You work, you owe. You work, you owe. And we see in Pollock, they talked about how revenue, taxes on revenues, income, were direct taxes. They're not indirect, it's a direct tax. The only reason why it's indirect is because it's only imposed on the corporate privilege, the licensed privilege, the foreign privilege, as an impost duty or excise on foreign persons in foreign places, on commodities, alcohol, tobacco, farms. And what do we see in the code, in Title 20, the Code of Federal Regulations? Every single one of the enforcement statutes is related to the tax as an excise. Title 27, Part 70, ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Every single one of the enforcement statutes. There's no enforcement authority within the 50 states outside of ATFs. Subtitle E, Article 1, Section 8, indirect taxation by impost duty and excise. That's where all the enforcement focus is. On activities and transactions taxable to the federal government, and the activity of persons inherently taxable to the government, like the corporate person, the foreign person, the licensed person. But the individual is not the inherently taxable person, and your labor isn't an activity subject to federal taxation by impost duty or excise. And they know that, and that's why they had to lie and claim it was a direct tax under the 16th Amendment on all Section 61 sources. But now that it's not a direct tax, it's indirect, you can't claim it's based on Section 61 sources. You have to show a foundation and impost, foreign, duty, exported, or excise, ATF, licenses, and corporations. If you don't engage in any of those activities, there's no indirect tax that reaches you, and income isn't a new power, a fourth power to tax indirectly. Based on sources, that would be a direct tax, not indirect, and the court said no new powers are created, and there's no enabling enforcement clause in the 16th Amendment to authorize Congress to write any law to enforce any allegedly newly created power, whether that power be direct and without limitation, which was fraud for 75 years, the constitutional fraud, which is why neither the tax nor the IRS can survive the coming revelation. This is Thomas Freed, and if you want to learn how to solve the problems, get on over to taxfreedom.com. We'll be talking about that next week. Okay, this is We're out.